What would you do if the woman destroying your marriage was sitting right across from you at your own dining table, sipping your expensive wine, brushing her knee against your husband's leg under the silk tablecloth? Most wives would scream. Most would throw a glass. But Victoria Belmont wasn't most wives. She smiled, poured another glass of Cabernet, and waited for the main course to serve a dish of revenge, so cold it would absolutely freeze the entire room. The August evening air in the Hamptons was perfectly still, carrying only the faint rhythmic sound of the Atlantic Ocean and the scent of blooming night jasmine. Inside the Belmont estate, a sprawling, modern colonial masterpiece of glass and whitewashed brick, everything was curated to absolute perfection. Victoria Belmont stood in the center of the formal dining room, her fingers expertly adjusting a centerpiece of white hydrangeas and silver-dusted eucalyptus. At 42, Victoria was a woman composed of sharp angles and devastating grace. Her emerald green silk dress draped flawlessly over a figure maintained by sheer discipline. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, her 15th wedding anniversary, with Richard Belmont, the charismatic CEO of Apex Logistics. To the outside world, the Belmonts were the undisputed golden couple of New York's elite. They were philanthropic, photogenic, and staggeringly wealthy. But as Victoria traced the rim of a baccarat crystal wine glass, her slate-grey eyes held no warmth. She was a woman standing in the wreckage of her own life, though the walls hadn't officially fallen yet. Footsteps echoed on the oak floorboards. Richard entered, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored navy blazer. He was handsome in that effortless aging wealth kind of way, silver at the temples, a jawline that hadn't softened, and a smile that had closed million-dollar deals, and as Victoria recently learned, unzipped the dresses of women half her age. "Everything looks incredible, Vic," Richard said, stepping behind her. He placed a kiss on the crook of her neck, his hands resting lightly on her waist. A month ago, that touch would have sent a familiar, comforting warmth through her. Tonight, it took every ounce of Victoria's iron willpower not to flinch. She simply tilted her head, offering a cool, practiced smile. "Only the best for tonight, Richard," she murmured, her voice smooth as glass. "It's a milestone, after all. 15 years. We should ensure it's a night no one ever forgets." "It will be," he agreed, completely oblivious to the double meaning laced into her words. "Charles just texted. He's pulling up to the gates now. He said he's bringing a date, a new girl he's been seeing for a few weeks." Victoria's pulse gave a solitary, hard thud. A new girl. Charles Davenport was Richard's chief operating officer and closest confidant. He was also freshly divorced and notoriously desperate to prove he still had his youth. When Victoria had designed the guest list for this intimate dinner party of 8, just their closest inner circle, she had told Charles he was welcome to bring a +1. She hadn't anticipated the identity of the +1, but as the doorbell rang and the sweeping oak doors were opened by the housekeeper, Victoria felt the universe hand her a loaded gun. Charles walked into the grand foyer, beaming with the pride of a man punching well above his weight class, and clinging to his arm looking like a modern-day siren in a backless, champagne-colored gown, was Cassandra Hale. Cassandra, 28 years old, an independent art consultant, and for the last 8 months, Richard Belmont's mistress. Victoria didn't need to guess who she was. She had memorized every line of Cassandra's face from the high-resolution photographs sitting in a manila folder in a safety deposit box in Manhattan. She knew the exact shade of her highlighted blonde hair. She knew her favorite perfume, Tom Ford's Black Orchid, which was currently wafting into the hallway. But the real masterpiece of the moment wasn't Cassandra's arrival. It was Richard's reaction. Victoria stood perfectly still, watching her husband from her peripheral vision. Richard's charming smile froze. The colour drained from his face so fast he looked as though he were about to faint. His jaw tightened, a microscopic spasm of pure, unadulterated panic. Cassandra had gone completely rogue. Richard clearly had no idea she was using Charles to infiltrate his home. Cassandra's eyes met Richard's for a fraction of a second, a fiery, defiant gaze of a woman tired of being a secret. Then she looked at Victoria, offering a bright, saccharine smile. "Victoria," Charles boomed, stepping forward. "Thank you so much for having us. I want you to meet Cassandra. Cassie, this is Victoria and Richard Belmont." "It is an absolute honor," Cassandra purred, extending a delicate hand. Victoria took it. The younger woman's skin was warm, her grip firm. "The pleasure is entirely mine, Cassandra," Victoria said, her voice dripping with the kind of aristocratic warmth that felt like a hug, but was actually a chokehold. "Any friend of Charles is a friend of ours. Welcome to our home." Richard swallowed hard, finally stepping forward. "Charles, good to see you. And Cassandra, welcome." His voice was remarkably steady, though Victoria noticed the slight tremor in his fingers as he gestured toward the living room. "Let's get you some champagne." As they walked toward the lounge to join the other early arrivals, Evelyn and Harrison Tate, old money friends from Connecticut, Victoria, lingered behind for a moment. She looked at the meticulously set dining table, the 8-place cards written in looping calligraphy. With a serene smile, Victoria walked over to the table. She picked up Cassandra's place card, originally set next to Charles at the far end, and swapped it. She placed Cassandra directly to the right of Richard. Let the games begin. Dinner was served promptly at 8 o'clock. The dining room was bathed in the warm, flickering glow of taper candles, casting dancing shadows against the imported silk wallpaper. Victoria sat at the head of the table, perfectly positioned, to observe the chessboard she had meticulously arranged. At the opposite end sat Richard. To his right, Cassandra Hale. To his left, Evelyn Tate. Charles sat halfway down, happily oblivious, digging into his lobster bisque, while loudly discussing the current state of the stock market with Harrison. The tension radiating from Richard's end of the table was palpable, thick enough to be sliced with the silver butter knives. Richard was drinking his Chateau Margaux at an alarming rate. He kept his eyes fixed forward, or on his plate, terrified to cast even a sideways glance at the woman sitting inches away from him. Cassandra, however, was playing a dangerous, thrilling game. She was leaning in close when she spoke, her shoulder brushing against Richard's tailored sleeve. Every time she reached for her water glass, her arm crossed into his personal space. Victoria watched it all with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a volatile chemical reaction. How had it come to this? Victoria let her mind drift back to a rainy Tuesday 3 months prior. It hadn't been a stray hair on a lapel or a lingering scent of perfume that tipped her off. Victoria was too smart for clichés, and Richard was too careful. It was a routine audit of their personal offshore trusts. Victoria had always been the unseen financial architect behind Apex Logistics. While Richard was the charming face of the brand, Victoria was the ruthless strategist. While reviewing a quarterly statement from their Cayman accounts, she noticed a discrepancy, a recurring obscure consulting fee paid to an LLC named Aura Arts. It took Victoria's private investigator, a former FBI operative named Thomas Wright, exactly 48 hours to peel back the layers. Aura Arts was a shell company. Its sole beneficiary was Cassandra Hale. The funds were paying for a spectacular penthouse condo in Tribeca. From there, the dominoes fell rapidly. The burner phones, the business trips to London that were actually romantic getaways to St. Bart's, the sickeningly poetic text messages Thomas had intercepted. Richard hadn't just been sleeping with Cassandra. He had been funding her entire life with money Victoria had helped him earn. He had bought her loyalty with their shared wealth. "This bisque is absolutely divine, Victoria." Cassandra's voice suddenly cut through Victoria's reverie, pulling her back to the candle-lit room. Victoria blinked, fixing her gaze on the younger woman. "Thank you, Cassandra. It's a specialty of our chef. He uses a dash of cognac to cut the richness. Tell me, how did you and Charles meet?" Charles puffed his chest out slightly. "Actually, we met at a gallery opening in Soho. Cassie here has a brilliant eye for contemporary art. I was looking for a piece for my new bachelor pad, and she guided me toward a fantastic abstract canvas." "Is that so?" Victoria rested her chin on her steepled fingers. "An art consultant. How fascinating. You must spend a lot of time traveling to curate your collections. Paris, London, St. Bart's, perhaps." At the mention of St. Bart's, Richard choked on his wine. He quickly grabbed a linen napkin, coughing into it, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. "Are you all right, darling?" Victoria asked, her voice laced with mock concern. "Fine." Richard wheezed, his eyes wide, and panicked. "Swallowed wrong." Cassandra's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but she recovered smoothly. "I do travel quite a bit, yes. Though I find the most beautiful things are often hidden right in front of us in New York." She cast a daring, lingering look at Richard. She really is bold, Victoria thought. Bold but foolish. "I couldn't agree more," Victoria said smoothly. "In fact, I've always believed that people's true tastes are revealed not by what they display, but by what they keep hidden." Evelyn Tate, completely blind to the psychological warfare happening across the table, chimed in. "Oh, Victoria, speaking of beautiful things, I meant to ask about your anniversary gift. 15 years is the crystal anniversary, isn't it? Or is it watches?" "Crystal," Victoria confirmed, though Richard has always been a fan of more unconventional gifts. "Haven't you, Richard?" Richard was sweating now. A thin sheen of perspiration glistened on his forehead. "Victoria and I have everything we need." He managed to say, his voice tight. "The best gift is just being here. Together." "How romantic," Cassandra murmured, though her tone held a sharp, bitter edge. She reached for her wine, and as she did, the neckline of her dress shifted, revealing a stunning sapphire pendant resting against her collarbone. Victoria's eyes locked onto the gem. She knew that necklace. Thomas the investigator had provided a copy of the receipt. Richard had purchased it at Van Cleef & Arpels on 5th Avenue exactly 2 weeks ago. The price tag was a cool $90,000. "That is a breathtaking pendant, Cassandra," Victoria said softly, causing the entire table to quiet down. Cassandra touched the sapphire, a triumphant gleam in her eye. She thought she was winning. She thought she was establishing dominance in Victoria's own home. "Thank you, Victoria. It was a gift from someone very special." "He must be." Victoria smiled. "The cut is exquisite. Pear-shaped, surrounded by a halo of brilliant cut diamonds. It looks remarkably similar to a piece from the Van Cleef vintage collection. A man with taste like that is rare. He must be a very successful businessman." Charles chuckled, oblivious. "I can't take credit for that one, unfortunately. Cassie had it before we met." "Well," Victoria raised her glass, her eyes locking with Richard's terrified gaze. "To generous businessmen, may they always get exactly what they pay for." The clinking of glasses sounded like funeral bells in Richard's ears. Under the table, Victoria knew exactly what was happening. Cassandra was likely pressing her leg against Richard's, punishing him for his cowardice, reveling in the danger. And Richard was trapped in a nightmare of his own, making desperately praying for the dinner to end. But Victoria was just getting started. The main course arrived, a flawless duck confit with a cherry port reduction and truffled asparagus. The culinary perfection was entirely wasted on Richard, who was pushing his food around his plate as if it were laced with arsenic. The conversation had naturally shifted to business. Harrison and Charles were debating the ethics of corporate acquisitions, a topic Richard usually dominated. Tonight, however, the charismatic CEO was essentially mute. "It all comes down to loyalty, doesn't it?" Harrison was saying, gesturing with his fork. "When you acquire a smaller company, you're not just buying their assets. You're buying their secrets, their foundation. If the foundation is rotten, the whole structure eventually collapses." "I couldn't agree more, Harrison," Victoria chimed in smoothly. She gracefully cut a piece of duck, brought it to her mouth, and chewed thoughtfully. "Loyalty is the absolute bedrock. Without it, you just have a series of expensive betrayals." She let the word hang in the air. Betrayals. Cassandra, seemingly growing restless with Richard's lack of participation, and emboldened by the wine, decided to push her luck. But surely, Victoria, in business and in life, people outgrow their foundations. Sometimes an acquisition is necessary because the original partnership has gone stale. New blood brings new energy. The audacity of the statement caused a brief silence to fall over the table. Even Charles looked a bit surprised by his date's aggressive metaphor. Victoria slowly placed her silverware down. She dabbed her lips with her linen napkin, her gaze fixed on Cassandra, like a sniper peering through a scope. "An interesting perspective, Cassandra," Victoria said, her voice dropping an octave, losing the hostess warmth and adopting the boardroom chill that had made grown men cry during negotiations. But new blood is often just a polite term for a parasite. It drains the resources of the host until there's nothing left. And what the parasite never realizes is that once the host dies, the parasite dies with it. Cassandra's confident smile faltered. For the first time all evening, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossed her face. "Well," Charles laughed nervously, trying to cut the sudden suffocating tension. "That got a bit dark. Let's talk about something lighter. Richard, how are the plans for the new Tribeca distribution hub coming along?" At the word Tribeca, Richard accidentally knocked his fork off his plate. It clattered loudly against the crystal water goblet. "I'm sorry," Richard stammered, signaling for the staff. "Slipped." "Tribeca is a fascinating neighborhood," Victoria continued, smoothly ignoring her husband's fumble. "So vibrant. In fact, I was just looking at real estate there recently. Did you know the luxury condo market there is booming, especially those beautiful penthouses with the wraparound terraces, the ones that cost around, $4.5 million. Cassandra stopped chewing. The color drained from her lips. $4.5 million was the exact purchase price of the condo Richard had bought for her through the Aura Arts shell company. "Real estate is always a solid investment," Harrison nodded, taking a sip of his wine. "Only if the title is clear," Victoria corrected him softly. "Sometimes people buy properties through LLCs to hide their ownership. But the truth is, nothing is ever truly hidden. The paper trail always exists. It just takes the right set of eyes to follow it." Victoria turned her head slightly to look directly at her husband. "Isn't that right, Richard? You always say, 'Follow the money.'" Richard looked as though he were physically suffocating. He tugged at his collar. Yes, that's a common saying." "Are you warm, Richard?" Victoria asked, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You look incredibly flushed. Cassandra, dear, could you pour my husband some more water? You're sitting so close to him, practically on top of him, really." Evelyn let out a polite, slightly confused laugh, assuming it was a joke about the table arrangement. But Charles frowned, looking between his boss, his date, and the hostess. Even to a man blinded by his own ego, the atmosphere was becoming undeniable. Victoria decided it was time to officially light the match. She stood up from the head of the table. The silk of her dress rustled in the quiet room. She picked up her wine glass and tapped it lightly with her knife. Clink, clink, clink. "If I may have everyone's attention," Victoria announced. The room fell dead silent. "Tonight is a very special night. 15 years of marriage. In today's world, that is quite an achievement. It requires dedication, sacrifice, and above all, honesty." Richard closed his eyes. He knew it was coming. He didn't know how or what exactly she knew, but the executioner's axe was hovering over his neck. "Richard and I have built an empire together." Victoria continued pacing slowly behind her chair. "Apex Logistics wouldn't exist without our partnership. We've shared every triumph, every failure, and every secret." She stopped pacing and looked at her guests. "Traditionally, the host receives gifts. But tonight, I wanted to give something back to all of you. To thank you for playing your parts in our lives." Victoria signaled to the head housekeeper, Maria, who had been waiting silently in the shadows of the hallway. Maria stepped forward, carrying a silver tray. On the tray rested 4 small, exquisitely crafted wooden boxes, each inlaid with mother-of-pearl. "I had these custom-made," Victoria explained, as Maria walked around the table, placing 1 box in front of Charles, 1 in front of Evelyn and Harrison, 1 in front of Cassandra, and the final one in front of Richard. "Please." Victoria smiled, a terrifying, predatory curve of her lips. "Open them." Charles opened his first. "Cigars," he exclaimed happily. "Cuban. Victoria, you shouldn't have." Evelyn and Harrison opened theirs. "Oh, my word," Evelyn gasped. "Vintage silver wine stoppers. They're beautiful." "Thank you, darling." "You're very welcome," Victoria said. Then she shifted her gaze to the right side of the table. "Richard, Cassandra, don't be shy. Open your gifts." Cassandra's hands were visibly shaking. She looked at Richard, but he was staring at his box as if it contained a live bomb. Slowly, hesitatingly, Cassandra unlatched the brass hook on her wooden box and lifted the lid. She looked inside, and a sharp, audible gasp escaped her lips. She slammed the lid shut instantly, her breathing turning shallow and erratic. She looked at Victoria with pure, unadulterated terror. Richard, seeing Cassandra's reaction, felt his stomach drop to the floor. With trembling fingers, he opened his own box. He stared at the contents for 5 agonizing seconds. He didn't slam the box shut. He simply sat there paralyzed, his entire world collapsing in real time beneath the glow of the baccarat crystal chandelier. "What is it, Richard?" Charles asked, craning his neck, entirely confused by the sudden shift in mood. "What did you get?" Victoria remained standing, her posture perfect, her expression serene. She raised her glass of wine to her lips, took a slow, deliberate sip, and waited for the explosion. "Richard." Charles pressed the jovial warmth completely draining from his face as he looked at his boss's ashen complexion. "What's in the box? You look like you've seen a ghost." "He has," Victoria answered smoothly, her voice slicing through the heavy, suffocating silence of the dining room. She remained standing, a queen surveying a conquered battlefield. "He's seeing the ghost of his marriage, the ghost of his career, and the ghost of his incredibly foolish ego." Evelyn Tate lowered her silver wine stopper, her eyes darting between Victoria and Richard. "Victoria, darling, I don't understand. What is happening?" "Allow me to clarify for everyone," Victoria said, taking a leisurely step toward Cassandra's side of the table. She reached out, and with a flick of her manicured finger, flipped the lid of Cassandra's box back open. Inside rested 2 items. The first was a pristine, high-resolution 8x10 photograph. It captured Richard and Cassandra on the sun-drenched balcony of a private villa in St. Bart's. Richard's hands were wrapped intimately around Cassandra's waist, his face buried in her neck. Charles leaned over to look. The moment his eyes registered the image, all the air seemed to vanish from the room. A dark, dangerous shade of purple began to creep up his neck. He stared at the photograph, then slowly turned his head to look at the woman sitting beside him, the woman he had proudly brought into this home as his date, Cassie. Charles whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of profound humiliation and rising rage. Are you sleeping with Richard?" Cassandra shrank back into her chair. The bravado she had displayed moments earlier had evaporated completely, replaced by the cornered panic of a trapped animal. "Charles, it's not what it looks like. I can explain. It's exactly what it looks like, Charles." Victoria interjected her tone, almost gentle now, the sympathetic edge of a surgeon about to make a necessary amputation. "For the past 8 months, Richard has been funding an opulent double life with Miss Hale here. She didn't meet you at a Soho gallery by accident. She targeted you. When Richard tried to cut back their time together, because I was growing suspicious, she used you as a Trojan horse to walk right through my front door. You used me." Charles demanded, his voice rising to a shout that rattled the crystal on the table. He slammed his fist down, causing Evelyn to jump. "You used me to get to him right in front of his wife." Cassandra's eyes welled with tears, a practiced manipulative weapon she undoubtedly used to her advantage. She reached for Richard's arm. "Richard, please, tell them. Tell her we love each other." Richard yanked his arm away, as if her skin were made of burning coals. "Don't touch me," he hissed, his voice trembling. He finally looked up at his wife, his eyes wide with desperate pleading. "Victoria. Vic, please. Let's talk about this in private. Not here, not in front of them." "Private?" Victoria laughed, a sharp, crystalline sound, entirely devoid of humor. "You gave up the right to privacy the moment you bought her a $4 million penthouse with Apex Logistics funds. Which brings me to the second item in Cassandra's box." Victoria reached into the small wooden chest and pulled out a heavy silver key. She dropped it directly into Cassandra's water goblet. It hit the bottom with a dull clink, sending ripples through the crystal glass. "That is the key to the Tribeca penthouse." Victoria stated, her eyes locking onto Cassandra's tear-streaked face. "As of 2 o'clock this afternoon, the locks have been changed. You see, Cassandra, when Richard bought that property through his little shell company Aura Arts, he used funds that were legally tied to a joint trust, a trust I control. My attorneys filed an emergency injunction yesterday morning proving the assets were embezzled. The property has been seized." Cassandra's jaw dropped. The carefully constructed facade of the sophisticated art consultant shattered entirely, revealing the panicked opportunist underneath. "You can't do that. That's my home. All my things are in there. Your personal belongings, the designer clothes Richard bought you, the luxury handbags, and the very cheap drugstore makeup you prefer have been meticulously packed by a bonded moving company," Victoria replied, without missing a beat. "They are currently sitting in a storage unit in Queens. The rental fee is paid for exactly 30 days. I suggest you find a U-Haul." "You bitch!" Cassandra spat, her veneer of politeness vanishing as pure venom took over. She stood up her chair, scraping violently against the oak floorboards. "You think you're so perfect. He doesn't even love you. He told me you were cold. He said you were a robot in the bedroom and a tyrant in the office. He was going to leave you for me." A heavy, horrific silence blanketed the dining room. Harrison Tate sat frozen, a piece of asparagus, suspended halfway to his mouth. Evelyn was clutching her pearl necklace as if it might fly away. Victoria didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply smiled, a slow, terrifying smile that made Cassandra subconsciously take a step back. "Did he?" Victoria asked softly. She turned her gaze to Richard, who was now sweating profusely, his hands trembling violently. "Is that what you told her, Richard? That you were going to leave me?" "No." Richard gasped, his voice cracking. "Vic, I swear to God, no. It was just talk. It meant nothing. She meant nothing. It was a midlife crisis. A stupid, colossal mistake." Cassandra whipped her head toward Richard, utterly betrayed. "A mistake. You told me I was your soulmate. You bought me a sapphire. I bought you off to keep you quiet." Richard screamed back at her, his composure entirely destroyed. He looked pathetic, a powerful CEO reduced to a sniveling, cornered rat in a bespoke suit. "You wouldn't leave me alone. You threatened to tell Charles, to tell the board." "Enough," Victoria commanded. The single word cracked like a whip, silencing them both instantly. She walked slowly back to her seat at the head of the table. "This bickering is incredibly vulgar. We are eating perfectly good duck confit, and I will not have it ruined by the whining of a mistress and the cowardice of a cheating husband." Victoria sat down, smoothing the napkin over her lap. "Now, Richard, I believe it is time you look at the second item in your box." Richard stared at his wooden box. Beside the printed receipt for the Van Cleef and Arpels sapphire necklace lay a sleek black USB drive and a single sheet of heavy watermarked paper folded into thirds. With hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the paper, Richard unfolded it. His eyes scanned the document. His breathing stopped. The room watched as the last remaining ounces of blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a polished corpse. "What is it, Richard?" Harrison asked, leaning forward, his business instincts overriding the shock of the social scandal. "Is it a divorce filing?" "Oh, the divorce papers were filed on Monday," Harrison Victoria casually noted, taking a sip of her Cabernet. "An airtight execution of our prenuptial agreement. Due to the infidelity clause which I have documented with an agonizing amount of evidence, Richard leaves this marriage with precisely what he brought into it 15 years ago, a moderately successful middle management resume, and a very nice collection of ties." Richard couldn't speak. He was staring at the paper in his hands as if it were entirely written in a language he couldn't comprehend. "The document Richard is holding," Victoria explained to the table, "is a letter of resignation, effective immediately. He is stepping down as CEO of Apex Logistics, citing severe sudden health issues." "You can't do this," Richard choked out, his voice barely a whisper. He looked up at Victoria, his eyes bloodshot and wide with terror. "Apex is my company. I built it. The board will never accept this. They love me." "They love the profits, Richard," Victoria corrected him icily. "Profits that I engineered. Which brings us to the black USB drive in your box." Victoria leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, steepling her fingers. The time for aristocratic pleasantries was over. This was the boardroom execution she had meticulously planned. "You thought you were just having a cliché affair, didn't you?" Victoria asked softly. "You thought you were just a powerful man, indulging in a beautiful younger woman. You thought your only crime was breaking your marriage vows." Richard swallowed hard, a drop of sweat rolling down his temple. "What are you talking about?" Victoria shifted her gaze to Cassandra, who was still standing defensively by the table. "Tell them, Cassandra. Or should I call you by your legal name, Cassandra Pierce?" The name dropped into the room like an anvil. Charles gasped. Harrison dropped his fork completely. "Pierce!" Charles repeated, his eyes darting between Victoria and the Mistress. As in, Dominic Pierce, the CEO of Horizon Freight. Horizon Freight was Apex Logistics' fiercest, most ruthless competitor. For the past 3 years, the two titans had been locked in a brutal price war, battling for international shipping contracts. Got it in one. Charles Victoria nodded her eyes, never leaving Cassandra's terrified face. Cassandra is Dominic Pierce's niece, a lovely, bright girl who was struggling to pay her rent in Brooklyn until her uncle offered her a very lucrative job, corporate espionage. "That's a lie!" Cassandra shrieked, though her panicked eyes darted toward the exits. "You're making this up." "Am I?" Victoria pressed a button on a small remote hidden beneath the table. The massive flat-screen television mounted on the far wall of the dining room, usually reserved for displaying digital art, clicked on. The screen displayed a series of security camera stills. They showed Cassandra inside the St. Bart's villa, sitting alone at the kitchen island, while Richard was presumably sleeping. In front of her was Richard's encrypted work laptop. In her hand was a small silver flash drive. "While you were sleeping off your champagne hangovers, Richard," Victoria said, her voice laced with lethal disgust, "your soulmate was downloading our proprietary routing algorithms. She stole our vendor pricing sheets. She took the bidding strategies for the upcoming Department of Defense contract, a contract we lost to Horizon Freight just 3 weeks ago. A loss of $400 million. Richard slumped back in his chair. He looked physically destroyed, as if someone had just hollowed out his chest with a shovel. He looked at Cassandra, his expression shifting from anger to complete, shattered devastation. "You," Richard breathed. "You were stealing from me every time we were together." Cassandra backed away from the table, her hands raised defensively. "He promised me a percentage," she stammered, abandoning the denial as the photographic evidence glared from the wall. "He said if I got the algorithms, he would set me up with my own gallery. I didn't want to hurt you, Richard. It was just business." "Just business," Victoria echoed, shaking her head. "And what bad business it was. You see, Cassandra, the USB drive in Richard's box contains the complete forensic audit of his laptop. It proves his negligence. It proves his unauthorized transfer of company funds to your shell company. But more importantly, it contains the IP logs of every document you stole." Victoria stood up, smoothing the front of her emerald dress. She looked absolutely radiant, fueled by the cold, pure energy of absolute victory. "At 6 o'clock this evening, while you were doing your makeup for this dinner party, Cassandra Victoria announced, 'My attorneys delivered that exact forensic report to the FBI field office in Manhattan alongside a formal complaint of corporate espionage against Dominic Pierce and Horizon Freight.'" Cassandra let out a choked sob, clapping a hand over her mouth. "By tomorrow morning," Victoria continued, her voice echoing in the silent room, "Horizon Freight's headquarters will be raided by federal agents. Dominic Pierce will likely be arrested, and you, my dear, will be facing a minimum of 10 years in federal prison for conspiracy and theft of trade secrets." Cassandra didn't wait for another word. She spun on her heels, the champagne-colored gown whipping around her legs, and bolted out of the dining room. They heard her frantic footsteps slapping against the marble floor of the foyer, followed by the heavy slam of the oak front door. Charles sat perfectly still, staring blankly at the empty chair beside him. "My God," he whispered. "I brought a federal spy into the company." "You were manipulated, Charles," Victoria said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You were a pawn." "But Richard," she turned back to her husband. Richard was weeping openly now, his face buried in his hands. The silver fox, the titan of industry, utterly broken. You handed them the keys to the kingdom because you couldn't keep your pants zipped, Victoria said, her voice devoid of any pity. If you refuse to sign that resignation letter tonight, the board will receive the full file tomorrow. You will be fired for cause, sued for breach of fiduciary duty, and potentially indicted alongside her. Sign the paper-claim health issues and walk away with whatever shreds of dignity you have left. Richard slowly lowered his hands. He looked at the resignation letter. He reached into his breast pocket, pulled out his Mont Blanc pen, an anniversary gift from Victoria, 10 years prior, and with a violently shaking hand, he signed his name on the dotted line. Victoria stepped forward and smoothly pulled the paper from beneath his fingers. "Dinner is concluded," Victoria announced, turning to her horrified guests. "Evelyn Harrison, Charles. I apologize for the theatrics, but some tumors must be removed aggressively. Maria will show you out." As the guests hurriedly scrambled to their feet, desperate to escape the blast radius of the Belmont marriage, Victoria looked down at Richard one last time. "You have until midnight to pack your things and leave my house," she said quietly. "If you are still here at 12:01, I will have the security team physically remove you." Richard didn't argue. He didn't beg. He simply stared at the half-empty glass of Margot, knowing he had just traded his entire universe for a woman who was actively selling him to his enemies. The silence that descended upon the Belmont estate after the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind the guests was absolute. It was the kind of deafening quiet that follows a catastrophic explosion, where the dust hasn't quite settled, but the sheer magnitude of the destruction is brutally apparent. In the dining room, the crystal chandelier still cast its warm, golden light over the remnants of the ruined anniversary dinner. Maria, the head housekeeper, and 2 uniformed staff members moved silently into the room. They began clearing the plates, meticulously, avoiding eye contact with Richard, who was still sitting in his chair at the far end of the table. To them, he was already a ghost. Victoria didn't stay to watch him wallow. She turned gracefully the silk of her emerald dress, gliding across the floor, and made her way down the long corridor to the library. The library was Victoria's sanctuary. It was a stunning room, panelled in dark mahogany, smelling faintly of old paper leather, and the expensive scotch she kept in a crystal decanter on a side table. She poured herself a measure of Macallan, the amber liquid splashing softly into the heavy glass, and walked over to the tall arched windows that looked out over the darkened Atlantic Ocean. It was 10:45. He had exactly 1 hour and 15 minutes. 10 minutes later, the door to the library creaked open. Richard stood in the threshold. He had taken off his bespoke navy blazer and loosened his silk tie. He looked 10 years older than he had when the evening began. The silver at his temples no longer looked distinguished. It just looked tired. "Vic," he whispered, his voice hoarse, shattered by the evening's revelations. Victoria didn't turn around. She took a slow sip of her scotch. "I told you to pack, Richard. The clock is ticking." He stepped into the room, his footsteps heavy and dragging on the Persian rug. "You can't really mean this. 15 years, Victoria. We built this life together. I know I made a mistake, a catastrophic, unforgivable mistake. But to throw me out into the street like a stray dog, to take my company. Your company." Victoria finally turned, her slate-grey eyes pinning him to the spot. "Do you really believe Apex Logistics is your company? You were the charismatic smile we put on the brochures, Richard. You were the firm handshake on the golf course. But who negotiated the merger with the European distributors in 2018, who identified the tax loopholes in the Cayman accounts that kept us afloat during the recession, who just saved our entire proprietary routing system from being auctioned off to the highest bidder by your 28-year-old girlfriend." Richard winced at the mention of Cassandra, a fresh wave of humiliation washing over his features. "I didn't know who she was. You have to believe me, Vic. I had no idea she was Dominic's niece. I was played." "Which is exactly why you are no longer fit to be CEO," Victoria replied with cold, surgical precision. "If you are stupid enough to let a rival corporation infiltrate your bedroom, you are too stupid to run a multi-billion-dollar logistics empire. You are a liability, and I eliminate liabilities." Richard's sorrow suddenly curdled into defensive anger. "You planned this. You orchestrated this whole dinner party just to humiliate me, to break me in front of my closest friends." "They aren't your friends, Richard," Victoria corrected him, walking slowly toward her mahogany desk. "Harrison respects money. Charles respects power. By tomorrow morning, when the news of your resignation hits the wire, neither of them will ever return your phone calls again. You are radioactive. And yes, I planned it. Did you honestly expect me to discover your infidelity, your embezzlement, and your catastrophic security breach, and quietly ask for couples counseling?" She set her scotch glass down with a definitive thud. "You have 50 minutes, Richard. I suggest you focus on your luggage rather than your bruised ego." Richard stared at her, searching for any flicker of the woman who had promised to love him for better or worse. But he found nothing. The woman standing before him was forged in iron and ice. He had created this monster by underestimating her, and now she was going to consume him whole. Without another word, Richard turned and walked up the grand staircase to the master suite. The next 45 minutes were a pathetic, frantic scramble. Richard Belmont, a man accustomed to having valets pack his monogrammed Louis Vuitton trunks, was frantically shoving tailored suits, dress shirts, and pairs of Italian leather shoes into whatever suitcases he could find. His hands shook violently as he emptied his safe, grabbing his Rolex watches and whatever cash was kept on hand. At exactly 11:55, he dragged 2 heavy suitcases down the sweeping marble staircase. He was sweating, breathing heavily, completely stripped of his dignity. Standing in the grand foyer flanking the front door were 2 massive men in dark suits. Garrison, the head of the Belmont Estate's private security detail, stood with his hands clasped firmly in front of him. Victoria stood halfway down the hall, watching the pathetic exodus. "Garrison will escort you to the gates," Victoria said, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. "Your black Mercedes has been left for you. The company cars have been repossessed. My lawyers will contact your lawyers on Monday regarding the division of your remaining personal assets, though, as I mentioned, the prenuptial agreement leaves very little room for negotiation." Richard stopped at the door. He looked back at the sprawling, magnificent home that had been the ultimate symbol of his success. Then he looked at his wife. "You're going to be completely alone, Victoria," he said, a desperate attempt to land one final venomous blow. "You have your money and your company, but you have no one." Victoria smiled, a terrifying, predatory curve of her lips that chilled him to the bone. "I'd rather sleep in a bed of gold coins than share it with a traitor. Goodbye, Richard. Don't slip on the marble on your way out." Garrison opened the heavy oak doors. The cool, salty night air rushed into the foyer. Richard stepped out into the darkness, dragging his luggage behind him. The doors closed with a heavy, echoing thud, sealing the tomb of his former life forever. 72 hours later, the corporate world of New York City exploded. It began early Tuesday morning, precisely at 6 a.m., when a convoy of black SUVs belonging to the Federal Bureau of Investigation pulled up to the glass-fronted headquarters of Horizon Freight in downtown Manhattan. Agents in windbreakers flooded the lobby, seizing servers, locking down executive suites, and marching out boxes of hard drives. By 8 a.m., the financial news networks were in a frenzy. The headline ticker across the bottom of every screen screamed, Horizon Freight raided by FBI. CEO Dominic Pierce detained in massive corporate espionage scandal. At 9 a.m., an emergency meeting of the Apex Logistics Board of Directors was convened in the penthouse boardroom of their Manhattan skyscraper. The room was a panicked hive of elderly, wealthy men in charcoal suits. They were terrified. Their CEO had abruptly resigned for health reasons over the weekend, and now their biggest rival was being raided by federal agents. The air was thick with confusion and anxiety. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. Victoria Belmont walked in. She wore a perfectly tailored charcoal grey Tom Ford suit, a crisp white silk blouse, and a single string of flawless South Sea pearls. She carried a leather portfolio, and she walked with the absolute, unquestionable authority of an apex predator, claiming her territory. The murmurs in the room died instantly. "Gentlemen," Victoria said, her voice clear and commanding. She did not walk to the side of the table reserved for guests. She walked directly to the massive leather chair at the head of the table, the seat Richard had occupied for a decade. She sat down. Victoria first all. Arthur, the chairman of the board, stammered, adjusting his glasses. "What is the meaning of this? Where is Richard? What in God's name is happening with Horizon Freight?" Victoria opened her portfolio and seamlessly slid copies of a thick, bound document across the polished mahogany table. "Richard is currently residing in a short-term rental in New Jersey," Arthur, nursing a severe lack of judgment, Victoria announced, leaning back in the chair. "As for Horizon Freight, what you are seeing on the news this morning is the direct result of my actions." She let the board members quickly scan the executive summary of the documents she had provided. Gasps and muttered curses began to ripple through the room as they read the details: the honey trap, the stolen algorithms, the embezzled funds. For the past 8 months, Victoria continued smoothly cutting through their shock. Horizon Freight orchestrated a sophisticated espionage operation against us, utilizing Dominic Pierce's niece to compromise Richard's personal devices. They successfully stole our bidding strategies, which resulted in the loss of the Department of Defense contract last month. "Good Lord," one of the board members whispered, turning pale. "We're ruined. Our proprietary data is out there." "We are far from ruined," Victoria snapped, her voice cracking like a whip, forcing the room to look at her. "As soon as I discovered the breach, I hired private forensic investigators. I compiled the evidence, secured our internal servers, and handed Dominic Pierce to the FBI on a silver platter. Horizon Freight stock is currently plummeting. By the end of the week, they will be facing federal indictments and multi-billion-dollar civil suits. We will absorb their market share before the quarter is over." She paused, letting the magnitude of her victory sink into their minds. They weren't looking at the grieving wife of a disgraced CEO. They were looking at their savior. "Richard was a fool who nearly cost us this company," Victoria concluded. "He has resigned, and he has signed over his voting shares to me as part of our divorce settlement. I am stepping in as interim CEO, effective immediately. Though once you see the quarterly projections I've prepared in that folder, I expect the interim title to be dropped by Friday." The boardroom was dead silent. Then slowly Arthur nodded. "You have the floor, Victoria. Show us the projections." Victoria had won. The king was dead, and the queen had formally taken the throne. Later that afternoon, as Victoria sat in her new sprawling corner office overlooking the Hudson River, her private cell phone buzzed on the glass desk. She glanced at the caller ID. It was an unknown number. She pressed the speaker button. "Hello, Victoria." The voice was ragged, weak, and choked with tears. It was Cassandra. Victoria didn't smile. She just leaned back in her chair. You are remarkably brave to be calling this number Cassandra, or remarkably stupid. I assume the FBI has already confiscated your passport. They took everything. Cassandra sobbed, the sophisticated facade completely obliterated. They raided my apartment this morning. They took my phone, my laptop, my bank accounts are frozen. My uncle is blaming the whole thing on me. He told the feds I went rogue. They're talking about a 15-year sentence, Victoria. Please. I know you hate me, but I was just following orders. If you just tell the lawyers to show some leniency on the civil suit, I can afford a defense attorney. Victoria listened to the desperate, pathetic pleading. She thought about the dinner party, about the arrogant way Cassandra had brushed her knee against Richard's leg, about the Van Cleef sapphire she wore like a trophy. Cassandra, Victoria said softly, her voice devoid of any human empathy. Do you remember what I told you at dinner about the parasite and the host? Cassandra sniffled loudly. Yes. The host is Apex Logistics, and we have successfully eradicated the infection, Victoria stated cleanly. You made a conscious decision to walk into my home, drink my wine, and smile in my face while you tried to dismantle my life. You thought you were a player in this game, but you were barely a pawn. I don't negotiate with pawns. Enjoy federal prison. Victoria reached forward and pressed the red button, cutting the line dead. She permanently blocked the number. She stood up from her desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city of New York stretched out below her, a sprawling grid of millions of people, millions of secrets, and millions of ambitions. Somewhere down there, Richard was sitting in a cheap furnished apartment, his reputation in ashes, his wealth locked behind ironclad prenuptial clauses. He had become a cautionary tale, whispered in the dark corners of Wall Street, the man who traded a kingdom for a fleeting moment of stolen pleasure. And somewhere else, Cassandra Pierce was sitting in an interrogation room, realizing that her youth and beauty were entirely useless currencies when faced with the crushing weight of the federal government. Victoria Belmont took a deep breath, the air conditioning of the executive suite cooling her skin. She had been betrayed, humiliated, and targeted. But she had not broken. She had taken the knife they plunged into her back, sharpened it, and cut their throats with it. She turned back to her desk, picked up her gold pen, and began to sign the acquisition papers that would effectively dismantle Horizon Freight piece by piece. The golden couple was dead. The queen of Apex Logistics had arrived. If Victoria's ultimate cold-blooded revenge had you glued to your seat, you are not going to want to miss the stories we have coming next. Betrayal, wealth, and ruthless payback are just the beginning. Did Richard get exactly what he deserved, or was Victoria's boardroom guillotine too brutal? Drop a comment below, and let us know whose side you're on. If you loved this story, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a good karma story, and absolutely smash that subscribe button so you never miss another dose of high-stakes drama.